Good evening. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes, if you don't mind. Just, if you still need to grab a water or drink, please do so. And I hope you had, I know that maybe not all of you, but I hope you had a chance to grab some food before you come in. If I may just go ahead and start it, and then since we have a 7 o'clock nationally televised or webinar, so I want to welcome to the 5th Chinatown Hall meeting. My name's Feng Ho. I'm the Chief Information Officer at the State College of Florida, and I'm serving tonight as the co-chair for this event. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come over to participate in this very important event. And of course, as we all understand that this event is to help promote the relationship and understanding of the critical relationship between the United States and China. It's really wonderful to see so many of you, the leaders from our local educational and business communities tonight. And I'm also very encouraged that we have some students from our collegiate school, the future leaders, and I will probably later to see if they are here yet, or they may still be out there. I see maybe 1, 2. So I'm really encouraged to see you there. And of course, I hope that you all had a chance to have some taste of Chinese food out there. I hope it's not too bad, But I do have to point out, though, that the sweet and sour chicken, as many of you may like it, is not really a traditional Chinese food. If you go to China, if you ask for that dish, you probably get disappointed. That's really an American Chinese invention. So before I would introduce SCF President Dr. Lars Havner, I'd just like to thank a few people here, Mr. Jim Icahn. I don't know if Mr. Jim is here yet, but and also Genuity, as well as Odato marketing groups for their generous support in underwriting this event. And I would also like to acknowledge my assistants, Marilyn Rouse, and the following people as well. That the SCF Associate Vice President of CCD, Daisy Valovich. I don't know if Daisy's here. And then also the CIT Operations Specialist, Julie Darner. And the SCF Director of Institutional Research, Suha Men. And those people probably who are outside helping, organizing. And of course, our web portal specialist, Gail McDaniel. And as well as the Public Affairs and Marketing of SCF for putting this event together. So please join me in giving them a round of applause for their help. State College of Florida President Dr. Lars Havner, as many of you already know, is a visionary leader. But he's also paying very close attention to the local community and the business community's needs. And say, for example, that a couple of years ago, the college started this 4-year workforce baccalaureate degree programs in such programs as Bachelor of Science in Nursing. And that's in direct response to the local community's urgent needs. And as of yesterday, news came back from the state that the State Board of Education had just approved 2 additional 4-year baccalaureate degree programs, the Technology Management and International Business and Trade, and along with 10 other different baccalaureate degree programs that SCF is offering, which truly reflects the local community's needs. So congratulations, Dr. Havner. Yeah. So without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce to you our leader, SCF President Dr. Lars Havner.
Thank you, Fong, and I too want to welcome each and every one of you here tonight. When this opportunity arose for SCF to help host this event, it was really a no-brainer in the fact that we need to become more involved with our globalization initiatives and working with different groups and different countries for the awareness that is necessary for us to improve our educational opportunities here in Manatee and Sarasota counties. And this event tonight is a stepping stone, I believe, to our future awareness of where we can go and how we can do it, because together we can really make this a destination not only for bringing international relations to our region, but also for us to export in certain cases our students and opportunities for their future well-being. As Fong mentioned, and as we'll talk a little bit on the panel, with our new International Business Baccalaureate, we're setting the stage for future opportunities and working with our Manatee County school system and Sarasota County school systems to be sure that we're preparing our students for the future in globalization. Tonight, dealing with the Chinatown Hall, I think, puts us on the cusp of where we need to be in the fact that when we're talking about what China means to the world economy and how partnerships with the United States and with our students who are our future leaders needs to be sure that we're moving in the same direction. And that's what I see as the basis for us being here tonight, listening, learning, educating ourselves, and producing an opportunity not only for like our collegiate students, but our students here at SCF, and again, all the people of this region, an opportunity for us to move forward and make some of these connections and relationships a lasting relationship, because after all, we have a destination here in our region. It's beautiful, we have the great climate, we have the beaches, we have opportunities, and those are things that we think others should come and share with us, while we too need to move out of the region and go across the ocean to other opportunities, because together we will work better as one than we do separately. So Fong, thank you. Thank all of you that are here tonight for making this an opportunity. SCF looks forward to sponsoring this in years to come, continually trying to create a bigger, more buzz, more opportunity. And I think if we put the right steps in, we've got something that will be really fabulous for our region. So welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Havner. And now I'd like to introduce my co-chair, my friend, Dr. Elliott. Dr. Elliott is a local professor, and he has lived in China for many years, and has also built a lot of important guanxi in China, if you know what that means. That's the critical context that can get the things done. And in China, you need a lot of those guanxis. So relationship or context. And Dr. Elliott has been actively involved in China-related communities, and he's currently serving as the board member of both the Gulf Coast Chinese community as well as the board of Chinese Friendship Association. Dr. Elliott.
Thank you, Fong. First of all, let me thank all of you for coming out tonight and say a few words about the National Committee. The National Committee was founded 45 years ago, and the objective of that committee was to build good, sound relationships, Sino-American relationships, because we know through that it's going to be better for the whole world. So their goal, I'll just read their goal for you, their mission. The National Committee of the United States-Chinese Relationships promotes understanding, cooperation between the United States and Greater China in the belief that a sound and productive Sino-American relationship serves both the vital interests of America and the world. Programs like this program we started 5 years ago, and the idea was to get communities even more aware, and this is just one step towards that. And we're very fortunate tonight to have a speaker from the National Committee that I'm going to introduce in a minute, and he'll talk about his experience in China, which varies. He lived there in China for a few years. And, in fact, I might as well start right now. Nancy Molnar, he's a China hand. He worked for, was it Daimler Chrysler or just Chrysler? Chrysler, and he represented them in China for 2 years. He lived there with his family, so he has a strong background there. After leaving that position, he moved into a ACE Group, which is a specialized company in dealing with international insurances, and he can explain that more to you, but his operation has brought him before Congress, through diplomatic services. He's been heavily involved in the Washington area, working with foreign governments and things. What else can I say about him? He's a national board member of the MS Association. He's also a national board member of the diplomatic group. So with that introduction, I'm going to ask Lancy. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. To come up here and talk to us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott. Thank you, Dr. Elliott. All right. I work for ACE Group, which is an international insurance company, and in my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the company, talk a little bit about our industry of insurance and how China relates to that, and then talk about China more broadly. And as Dr. Elliott said, I've had previous experience in the auto industry in China with Daimler Chrysler. And as some of you may know, Chrysler had the first joint venture in China in the automotive industry, Beijing Jeep, and there's been books written about that. So just very quickly, it's not my phone. I don't know. ACE is an insurance company. We're in 53 countries with a physical presence in terms of an office.
Sorry, go ahead.
And we have clients in over 170 countries. So we do property and casualty insurance, we do reinsurance, we do life insurance outside the United States. We have about 83 billion in assets and about 20 billion in gross written premium. So we are a very large company. We have about 16,000 employees. We're probably the biggest company you've never heard of, so I always have to do the commercial since many people haven't heard of us. Primarily because we don't do life insurance in the U.S., and that's how a lot of retail people get to know companies like MetLife or New York Life, but we don't do that here in the U.S. We do it in China. So that's a little bit about ACE. As you can see, all those things, we do well when the economy does well, both the U.S. economy and the global economy. When you insure marine, transportation, aviation, all those things are related to a robust economy. In terms of China, we entered about 10 years ago as a strategic partner of a company called Huatai, which was on the verge of bankruptcy. And over that 10-year period, it's been extremely successful. In 2005, we launched a joint venture to do life insurance, and now we have 20,000 agents in China selling life insurance. And we're now the third largest foreign invested insurer in China. So that's ACE. I wanted to talk a little bit about the industry, because I'll talk about insurance because that's what I'm working in right now, but you could basically copy this for almost any other sector. It could be telecoms, it could be autos. the point of everything I'm going to say is China is important and it's growing, and I don't think people have really caught up to how important China is in the global economy. So today, China is the sixth largest insurance market in the world, $215 billion in premiums. And I'll show you in what a short period they've grown into that position. And in probably 10 years, they will be the largest insurance market in the world. And in terms of opportunities for growth, at the end of 2009, there were 59 life insurers and 52 non-life insurers in China. You compare that to the US, which has 2,600 P&C insurers and over 1,000 life insurers. Shows you that there is a lot of room for growth. It's also a very concentrated industry in China. The top 10 life insurance companies account for 90% of all premium. They have few very big companies. Again, a lot of opportunities for growth. And in terms of business, for example, in the property and casualty business, 70% of that business is auto insurance, which is a very traditional form of insurance. What the US insurance industry does well is specialized insurance, anything from directors and officers insurance that we do, which universities need, for example. That's all new business in China. It's not being done. We're introducing a lot of that. So big opportunities for US insurers in China. So if you look at the total insurance market around the world, it's about a $4 trillion industry. Among the top 10 markets, the per capita premium is at the high end, $5,800 per person in a place like the Netherlands, or about $3,800. That's about how much the average individual spends in the US on insurance. In China, it's still $158, so very, very low. I think, and I'll show you a couple of charts here, and this is what I talk about, the sudden emergence of China's market. Premium growth in the top 10 markets grew about 1.5 times in the past decade, in the past 10 years. And China, in comparison, grew tenfold. And I'll show you a couple of slides that demonstrate that. China now has, PIC, as it's called, is now the 10th largest P&C company in the world. Again, basically from nothing to having the 10th largest insurance company. This demonstrates the top 10 insurance markets in the world over the top 10 over the last 10 years, and as you can see, it's pretty flat. There's no real growth here. The top line is the United States, which is 1/4 of all premium in the world is the U.S. The U.S. market is by far the biggest. And then you have a lot of European countries in the middle, Japan and Korea. And as you can see, it's pretty flat line, no real growth. You had a spike and then the financial crisis in '98 where you saw a sudden drop in many of the markets. Then you have China. Started at less than 20 trillion in 2000, or less than 20 billion. And just skyrocketing growth. And you see 2008, where in the other slide you had the financial crisis and markets dropping. In China, it only further increased. So when we talk about the importance of China to the global economy, when you look around the world, Europe in a recession, the US not in a recession but feels like it, you need a strong anchor, and right now China is that strong anchor. Some of the key facts that I think you should know about China if you don't already. China is the U.S.'s third largest trading partner, and if you read the news or hear your member of Congress, a lot of times in Washington, you would think that all we do is import from China and sell Chinese products in Walmart, and that's all, that there's no reciprocal benefit. But China is now the third largest trading partner for the U.S. and third largest export market for the U.S. So we are exporting an enormous amount of exports. And again, I'll reflect that on some slides. Again, if you're in Washington and Congress, there's a lot of debate about China's exchange rate and the RMB being tied to the dollar. And if the Chinese would just allow the RMB to appreciate, that would solve all our trade problems here in the U.S. And again, I'll show you some slides that just demonstrate that's not the case. We have our own fundamental problems. A lot of politicians like to blame China because it's an easy scapegoat, but that really is not the problem. Another perception is that China is the cheapest place to do business. Again, I'll show you some figures that will show that it is becoming much more costly to do business there. And companies don't go to China to build a manufacturing plant just to export back into the U.S. Today, companies are going to China to sell in China because, as I demonstrated in the previous slides, it's an enormous growth opportunity. And one of the biggest challenges for companies in China is actually finding and retaining employees. Skilled employees are very in limited supply in China, so we find great people, we train them, and they're stolen from us by our competitors very quickly. It's a very competitive employment market. In terms of, there's a lot of other things to know about China, and we could get into that in Q&A. I think maybe some of the things that a local community would be interested in is the investment side, the Chinese investment in the U.S., which is also increasing dramatically. Chinese companies spent $5 trillion in the U.S. Last year in investments. So there's a lot of opportunity in terms of Chinese investment in the U.S. So this is the U.S. export growth to China over the last 10 years. As some of you may know, in 2000, China entered the World Trade Organization, which put a number of trade laws in place that China had to abide by, opening its market, and the result has been this exponential growth in U.S. exports. So exports to China have increased nearly 470% in this 10-year time period, whereas U.S. exports to the rest of the world have only grown 55%. So enormous growth, and a lot of this is basically keeping us out of a recession, the fact that we're able to export this much to China. This, a little bit more local, Florida exports to China, a little bit over $1 billion per year now in 2010. Florida's exports to China have increased almost 100%, so actually it's less than the U.S. Average, which means that Florida probably has more room to grow its exports to China. Just so you know, some of the top Florida exports to China, it's chemicals, transportation equipment, computers and electronics, and processed food, which is probably orange juice, I guess. Just getting to this issue of the currency appreciation. What has happened over this 10-year period is, instead of the U.S. importing from all of Asia, a lot of that import has been consolidated into China. And so what would likely happen is if you had an appreciation of the yuan, you wouldn't have a sudden reemergence of significant manufacturing in the U.S. You would just see a shift to other developing markets, either in Asia or in Latin America. This next slide just shows, as the RMB appreciated by 30% over the last few years, imports from China actually increased. So an appreciating RMB doesn't necessarily address the trade deficit. In terms of the rising costs in China, that also is happening fairly rapidly. IPR issues are a continuous problem for foreign companies operating there. Raw material prices are increasing dramatically as China grows, its economy grows. The demand for all sorts of raw materials, energy, that's driving a lot of the global commodity prices right now. Competition is increasing dramatically. Lack of transparency is also an issue of increasing costs. There's a lot of new regulations. It's not always clear what companies are supposed to do. And the 12th five-year plan that's in effect now is also creating a lot of uncertainty. China is trying to shift from an export-led economy to a more domestic consumption-led economy. And that will take time, but it is a government goal, and usually when China has a goal, it usually achieves it. As I mentioned, the Chinese currency is not one of the top issues, at least for companies. But there are many issues to companies that are operating in China, and these are sort of the top concerns for U.S. companies and things that hinder further progress to exports or investment in China. The first is indigenous innovation. As I mentioned, China is trying to shift its economy from an export-led economy. It's trying to move up the value chain. And I don't know if any of you have seen the report on Apple, and basically all the intellectual property is done in the U.S. The manufacturing, which is a very small economic component, is done in China. And to many Chinese, that's offensive. They want to be able to do their own Apple iPads and come up with the technology. Some of the ways that they're trying to do that, foreign companies find objectionable in terms of trying to force technology transfer, requiring domestic production in order for government purchases in China. So there's a lot of work that the U.S. government is doing to address that issue, and the Chinese government is actually making changes in that area. IPR protection, again, the U.S. economy is basically driven by innovation. That is our biggest competitive advantage. And so to have our intellectual property rights stolen is a big concern. And we're also seeing progress in this area because as Chinese companies emerge, they have their own intellectual property rights, and they want to protect that intellectual property from other Chinese companies. And that's really how we're, I think, making a lot of progress with the Chinese government in terms of enforcement. Licensing is also a big issue. For example, insurance companies, we need a license to operate in any provincial level in China, and also at the city level. So we need licenses almost on a daily basis to operate in China. And it's one way that the Chinese government sometimes slows down foreign companies in China. Standards. This is another big area where China is trying to create its own standards, which again goes back to technology. They create their own standards, which their companies have a leg up on. This impedes, again, foreign companies from competing in China. Investment restrictions in many sectors, including autos. When I worked in the auto sector and in insurance, you're not allowed to have majority ownership, so you have to have a joint venture partner. Joint ventures create a lot of headaches. There's a saying about joint ventures in Chinese, you probably know the saying, same bed, different dreams. So that joint ventures are complicated. We have our own complications with our partner. Transparency is another big issue, as I mentioned, in terms of regulations. A lot of times in the U.S., we have a very formal process. There is a draft regulation. Industry can comment on it, industry and consumers, and then there's an implementation period. A lot of times in China, you don't know about the regulation until it comes out. Your Chinese competitors may know about it, which gives them, again, a leg up. And so the U.S. government is also addressing that issue, trying to get a more formal process whereby there's transparency in the regulatory process. There's a host of market access barriers that China continues to implement that we work with the U.S. government in terms of addressing. And finally, government procurement is a very big issue in China because the government is still a major portion of the Chinese economy. And so if the government decides that it's only going to buy Chinese products, it really inhibits foreign company growth in the market. One of the big concerns in the tech area, for example, is for many years Chinese government procurement didn't penalize illegal or copyrighted software. So many of the government agencies are operating copyrighted or copyright infringed Microsoft software. And again, if they just purchase legal software, it would be billions of dollars for U.S. companies. So these are some of the big issues that are problematic in the relationship, more so than the currency. And I think with that, I'm willing to take any question, personal from when I lived there and how it is to live there to anything else.
I know the National Committee has worked very hard on intellectual property rights and the procurement problems in terms of the Chinese government protecting its industry and they have an unfair advantage to compete. I'm really concerned. What I found most interesting in what you talked about was how the UN, the R&D, isn't that much of an impact. What are you actually doing? Let's take the auto industry. That's one of the big industries, and I know you have a background in it. What chance do we have? What inroads are we making from our auto industry into China?
I guess the question is, what inroads are we making in some sectors in the Chinese economy and autos specifically? Just on autos, for example, in 1984, when Chrysler went in with Beijing Jeep in the first auto joint venture, Chrysler was looking for one client throughout the whole country, and they couldn't find a private sector individual that wanted to purchase a vehicle. All the purchases were made by the government, and it was just several thousand vehicles, and this is in 1984. Last year, China sold 18 million vehicles, which surpassed the U.S. It is now the largest automotive market in the world. And some of the largest sellers of vehicles are American companies. GM, through its joint venture, sells more vehicles in China than it does in the United States. And as you know, the U.S. auto industry went through a very difficult time during the financial crisis and GM's bankruptcy. And they would have had a very hard time surviving had it not been for their China operations, which was basically the only profitable part of their business. So U.S. companies are doing very well in China in certain sectors. The challenge is, over the last 10 years, companies have been, because of WTO access, have been able to get into China. But they didn't face that much competition. Chinese companies were still emerging. Many of them were inefficient state-owned entities. Those Chinese companies are now becoming much more competitive, and they're going global. They're gaining international experience. And so this period of prosperity that a lot of companies enjoyed in China is becoming much more difficult and much more competitive. And I think that's the challenge going forward. And the U.S. has two options. You could basically try to close the U.S. down to all competition, or you could try to compete globally. And of course, as a company that competes globally, we would prefer the latter. As some Chairman Brady, who chairs the Trade Subcommittee on the Ways and Means Committee in Congress, said, the U.S. will never out-protectionist China. So we're better off by trying to further open China. And I think that's the goal of this. It's to educate people on the importance of China economically to our U.S. economy and for the global economy. He's got a mic, so.
Sorry. Could you comment, we hear a lot of safety issues and a lot of accidents, and from an insurer's standpoint, what sort of market does that open up for you? What is the sophistication level of workman's compensation, these sort of things? We're sort of a hotbed of workman's comp here in this area.
Right.
So just be interested to hear about how these safety issues and insurance work.
Yeah, it's, again, it's a huge, huge opportunity. Workman's comp, one issue, directors and officers insurance, following the safety issues that you're talking about. Environment is another enormous area where insurance is going to play a huge, huge role. The Chinese, they learn very quickly, and so when they had the tainted milk scandals and some of they react very quickly, and they recognize that this tarnishes the China brand, and so they are doing a lot of work right now in terms of the safety processes and government oversight of these manufacturing entities to make sure that they're producing legitimate, safe products. What that does when there's a lot of potential, if you're doing something really bad, criminal possibilities or civil possibilities, that increases the company risk, and that's usually when you start buying insurance. People don't necessarily buy insurance because they want to, it's usually because they have to. And so that is starting to develop. So when we talk about a lot of the opportunity that's happening in China, it is really, we're at the cusp. And that's why China will surpass the US in terms of the insurance market in the world in 10 years. It'll be very dramatic growth.
Nancy, I think we have time for a couple more questions, but we really do need to take
Yep.
a break.
Yep.
You define transparency in your presentation very narrowly about access to regulatory development. Frequently, it's actually used as a code word for corruption. So my question was, how big a concern still is corruption in China for businesses, particularly U.S. businesses that have to comply with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act?
It's still a huge, huge issue. Corruption, particularly at the government level, at the local level, is a huge problem. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I mean, I would argue it's actually benefits U.S. companies, not just in China, but around the world. People recognize that we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and that U.S. companies will not engage in corruption or in bribes because it is illegal, and they just won't do it. So it's almost a competitive advantage for U.S. companies. The Chinese will not seek it or expect it from U.S. companies. But in terms of domestic corruption, it's still a big issue because government officials, procurement officials, working with state-owned enterprises, which are also government-led in many instances, there's still a lot of corruption that's hard to overcome. This is a huge issue from a societal standpoint because the Chinese citizenry reads about it all the time. They know they have to address it. Again, in their 12th five-year plan, it's one of their priority issues is to address mostly government corruption. Yep.
I'm sure there are more questions for Yancey, and he will be around, and we'll try and answer them directly with you. But our clock is running quick, and the WebEx is going to start in 5 minutes. Thank you. We can take a quick break. We have about 10 minutes to take a break. The restrooms are open. There's still time to get water, whatever you need. During the WebEx, you will have a chance to send questions in, and there'll be 3x5 cards are available up here at the desk. If you take one of those, you write down your question, write your name down clearly. You'll get it up to Marilyn. It'll be typed in and sent directly to the webcast, and they will try and answer some of them. There are 51 venues this year in the webcast, so there are 51 cities taking part in tonight's operation. So hopefully we'll get some of our questions answered. With that, I'd say take a quick break, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes.
Good evening to those of you in the Eastern, Central, and Mountain States. Good afternoon to those of you on the West Coast and in Hawaii. I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome participants from 50 venues throughout the country to our 5th annual China Town Hall National Reflections Local Connections. We created this program in the belief that U.S.-China relations would be the defining relationship of the 21st century, and that getting the relationship right is critical to peace and stability throughout the world. In 1977, when the Carter administration took office, the United States and China had liaison offices in each other's capitals. While this was an improvement over the mutual isolation that existed before 1972, when President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger went to China, fully normalized relations between the two countries eluded the Nixon and Ford administrations. On December 15, 1978, that all changed when the two countries announced that they would establish diplomatic relations on January 1, 1979. They did, and the rest is history. As National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter throughout his entire administration, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski conceptualized and drove this process. During that period, I was an attorney advisor to the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and had the honor to participate in a small way and witness how Dr. Brzezinski successfully transformed the relationship. You have his biography, so let me just add, we are very fortunate that he is willing to share his insights into the diplomatic history of our two countries and the current state of Sino-American relations. Before turning the floor over to Dr. Brzezinski, I'd like to thank our partners at our venues and thank our small but very dedicated committee staff that has done a magnificent job in coordinating this complex nationwide event. Let me also thank our speakers, none of whom are paid. They have traveled throughout the country to talk with you about China because they believe, as we do, that educating Americans about China will help fashion policies that are in the long-term interest of the United States. In addition, we thank the Star Foundation for providing the funding for this exciting program. Last, but certainly not least, let me thank Dr. Brzezinski for joining us today. After his opening remarks, we will accept questions submitted electronically from all of our venues. We'll get to as many of them as we can, and I apologize in advance to those whose questions we don't have time to answer. Let me now turn it over to Dr. Brzezinski.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your very kind comments. I don't have any formal speech to make, but let me allude to a couple of the points that you have made. You mentioned the normalization of American-Chinese relations. That occurred several years after the initial Nixon-Kissinger breakthrough. But it is important to note in this connection that by 1976, 1977, the relationship was again somewhat frozen. We had a liaison mission in Beijing, the Chinese had a mission here, but there was increasing tension in the relationship. It wasn't moving forward. President Ford didn't feel able politically to cut the Gordian knot. Secretary Kissinger had a rather unpleasant meeting with Deng Xiaoping on his return from Vladivostok, where there were negotiations regarding a possible American-Soviet agreement, which Deng Xiaoping vigorously denounced, criticizing the then U.S. administration for being too soft on the Soviet Union. So when the president sent me to China sometime later, in a sense, that incident created an opportunity for a new dialogue, because I had no difficulty in convincing Deng Xiaoping that I viewed the Soviet Union as a menace and that the United States was prepared to compete as toughly as necessary, and that the United States was interested, seriously interested, in normalizing relations with China, and in the background of that, of having a somewhat common outlook on the then Soviet challenge. Deng Xiaoping defined it as hegemonism. And we actually were willing to use that word, in a sense, to underline the similarity of perspectives. So our relation opened up and developed not only then into a normalization, which was at some political risk because of the Taiwan issue, but it became also a quiet collaboration, which lasted several years until the fall of the Soviet Union. Since then, something else has happened. China was willing to normalize relations with us, not only because of its concerns with the Soviets. Deng Xiaoping realized that he needs normalization with the United States to launch China on a different socio-economic course. So that gave them an incentive. And we welcomed China's transformation. We weren't too worried about it until relatively recently, when fears started rising that this transformation was making China, for the first time, a serious rival to the United States. And now people are even speculating about the possibility of not only a rivalry, but a kind of hostility, pervasive, embracing the entire relationship. Analogies are drawn between Imperial Germany prior to 1914 and Great Britain. And we all know what followed. I think it's useful to bear that in mind, but it's also useful to think of it as a warning rather than as a forecast. The fact of the matter is that there is also something unique about the American-Chinese relationship, in spite of everything I've mentioned. Namely, that today, each side knows, and the leadership certainly know, even if they're publics, not fully, and that may be even more applicable to the American public than to the Chinese, that we need each other. If there was a significant rupture in the American-Chinese relationship, we would be damaged, they would be damaged. And at the same time, dynamics would be set in motion that could become internationally dangerous. So this is the new historical context in which we operate. It doesn't determine the future, but it gives us, I think, a healthy, useful perspective on how to handle the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a perfect segue into two things. One is it makes me want to read your book that will be coming out in January, which is called Strategic Vision, America and the Crisis of Global Power, which I assume will deal with some of those issues. And it also segues into the moderator's prerogative of asking the first question. I've already received a bunch of questions from the various venues, but let me start off with a question which came up this morning, which is the President of the U.S. is in Australia today. Secretary Clinton is in the Philippines, and the President is going to be giving a speech about what he calls America's pivot to Asia, that as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq wind down, our economic and strategic focus needs to shift to Asia. And I think there are few Americans who will disagree that the economic focus of the United States should be of Asia. So should be on Asia. He will also announce the basing of Marines in Darwin, Australia, increasing naval and air deployments, which appear, the New York Times headline tomorrow will say, this appears to be aimed at China, despite the fact that its military budget is a tiny percentage of America's military budget. So my question is, what do you think of kind of this pivot to Asia on the strategic security front?
I have not read the speech, so I can only comment on what you have just summarized to me. I think the pivoting to Asia makes sense generally, simply because Asia has emerged as an important force in world affairs. And this is not just China, but China, of course, is preeminent together with Japan. And we have to balance the new geopolitical realities. the fact of the matter is that the center of global gravity has shifted from the West exclusively to some sort of uncertain balance between the West and the East. I'm less enamored of the notion, if the President implies it, that we are doing this because we are terminating our military conflicts in Southwest Asia, and we are now going to pay more attention, with that perspective in mind, to the Far East. Because I don't think that at this stage we need to engage in a deliberate policy of formulating either formal or informal alliances, a web of alliances directed at China. I think doing that at this stage, to some extent, prejudges, potentially, the way the relationship will evolve, and it may encourage within China the more triumphalist and nationalistic elements which are present within the otherwise relatively centralized and controlled Chinese leadership. So I have no problem about America engaging itself on a continuing basis in Asia. I have no problem with the United States having some troops in Australia, which is a traditional ally. But the packaging of that message as involving some sort of a strategic shift from our military engagement in Southwest Asia to the Far East is, I think, perhaps not the best way of presenting what otherwise makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I hope I mean, again, I have not heard the speech yet. It's about to be given. And I think what they're saying is we need to strengthen our alliances in Asia, and not really saying it's that this is against China, that we seek to engage China.
Well,
we
but
have a
that
great
depends
relation.
on alliances with whom. I don't think the American commitment in a treaty form to Korea or to Japan was formulated necessarily against China. It was formulated to assure the security of these countries at a time when the Far East was still unstable, and there were still shock effects of World War II felt, as, for example, the Korean War. It's perfectly natural for us to be dealing cooperatively on security matters with the Australians. But if we get into the business of creating alliances on the mainland, whether we like it or not, it's going to have the appearance of being directed at China at a time when it may not yet be necessary. Perhaps at some future point it could be. But let's not, at this stage, prejudge the trajectory of the American-Chinese relationship as it evolves. Maybe we can handle it differently than Great Britain and Imperial Germany did after 1914. Maybe not, but let's not prejudge it in favor of not.
Let me start with questions from, I wholeheartedly agree, by the way. Let me start with questions from our venues. First one is from Portland, Oregon. Ray, how concerned should the U.S. be in the 21st century with seemingly growing nationalism in China, as you actually referred to?
Well, I think that is a legitimate concern. Chinese nationalism can be very strong. It can be indeed sometimes very fervent. We saw this after the incidents involving the disputed islands between China and Japan. Riots practically broke out at, for example, soccer matches involving the Chinese and the Japanese. And there was a kind of fervor in China over this issue. So we have to take that as a factor, as a dynamic factor in the relationship. So far, at least, the sense of confidence, of historical success that increasingly permeates the Chinese world outlook has not been accompanied by intensely nationalistic anti-Americanism. But it could. And incidentally, we have to be careful about that ourselves. I don't think that nationalist passions are necessarily the best way to stimulate political initiatives. They are sometimes called for, especially when one is threatened. And nationalism can be a very noble way of expressing patriotism, but it can also become sometimes somewhat blind.
This is from Angela Weck in Peoria, Illinois. The more the U.S. says it needs to be there to counter China, the more counterparts in China respond in kind. Both sides seem to ratchet up. Rather than compete, how does the United States and China cooperate more in areas other than trade? For example, how do we cooperate to work out a solution to the South China Sea dispute?
Well, Secretary Clinton addressed that issue, and she emphasized, in my judgment correctly, the principle of freedom of navigation. And that is good, and that is correct, and everyone has a stake in it. And incidentally, the same principle applies to the Strait of Malacca, through which so much of Chinese seaborne trade passes. But I think at the same time as we do that, we have to be careful not to be taking sides on some of the disputes that involve either economic zones or particular islands. To the extent possible, we ought to emphasize the principle of freedom of navigation, and secondly, the principle of international accommodation or mediation regarding these solutions. I think that it is important for us not to become a protagonist. And, you know, whether we become a protagonist or they become a protagonist first, it has a feedback always. And I think responsible leadership suggests that to the extent possible, we have to strive to lock China into an international framework in which it is truly in the interest of China to be responsible, cooperative, non-aggressive. But I think we're more likely to achieve that if we do what I've just said, rather than if we begin to rush headlong into some sort of construction of alliances and security positioning and so forth on the assumed premise that China will be hostile and threatening.
But don't we have a policy today that really is hedging, building our alliances, trying to build our constructive relationship with China while we strengthen those?
Well, I'm not sure with whom we're building those alliances yet, but I think if these words imply anything, it could mean more than, let's say, Japan or Korea or Australia. It could lead to American involvement on the mainland. And alliances involve obligations, and particularly if these alliances have a strong security component. After 10 years, the conflict in Iraq and maybe in the same time frame or a little more in Afghanistan, are we going to be opening the doors to some new engagements which have similar manifestations elsewhere on the mainland of Asia?
This is from Dorothy in Clemson, South Carolina. Does the United States' heavy economic reliance on China prevent the U.S. from voicing concerns about human rights violations in China? If so, what do you think it would take for the United States to feel obligated enough to intervene? Must a stable economy at home precede the advocacy of democracy and human rights elsewhere?
It doesn't prevent advocacy, but then there was another word used by the questioner which gives me rise to some speculation as to what it means. Intervene. Right. You know, we have a problem right now, for example, in Syria with very violent violations of human rights. But we're not in a position to intervene as we were able to intervene, and I supported President Obama on that in the case of Libya. Now, I think any person who knows anything about international affairs, and I'm sure the questioner does because the person sounds very intelligent, knows that China would be infinitely more complex. And what do we therefore mean when we say intervene? Now, if we want to cut off our trade with China or to forbid the Chinese to invest in the United States and not to acquire treasury bonds, we can do that. But whom are we going to hurt by doing that? Interventions only make sense, one, if they're justified, two, if they're successful. I think that's a fairly simple standard by which to judge them, but it's a useful standard.
Speaking of Syria, this is from San Francisco. Keith Hand. Last month, China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution on the crisis in Syria. This resolution arguably was less robust than a February security resolution on Libya that China approved. How should we interpret these two votes, and what do they tell us about China's evolving role on the Security Council?
I think what they say is that the Chinese have a very different view than we have of repression by governments. I think the Chinese have this notion that ultimately sovereignty, national sovereignty, means what the word sovereignty implies. And they are reluctant, therefore, to accept the notion that there are certain moral obligations that transcend traditional lines of sovereignty. On this, we have a legitimate and serious difference of view, a philosophical difference. And having a decent relationship with an important country, in this case we're talking about China, doesn't mean that we have to abandon our principles. But it also means, as a practical matter, that we have to make judgments regarding how effective can simply protestations or condemnations be. At what point do they have to involve actions which conceivably can also entail consequences and costs?
Jessica from Middlebury, Vermont. Does the expansion of Chinese sea power in the form of its first aircraft carrier represent an opportunity for China to collaborate with the United States in policing sea lanes and the South China Sea, or a potential threat to U.S. power?
If we're serious in judging this particular development, namely this aircraft carrier, I don't think it really threatens American power. And for one thing, I wonder whether many people know what are the origins of this aircraft carrier.
Ukraine.
It was built in Ukraine more than 20 years ago. It was sold for scrap and was towed to China, and then at one point there was some thought of making it into a casino offshore of Macau near Hong Kong. Now it's been modernized, developed into an aircraft carrier. I think that aircraft carrier, if we look at it strictly militarily, might be helpful to the Chinese if they wanted to assert, perhaps even excessively so, their presence in the South China Sea, which is not far away. Conceivably, although that's already a stretch, it could be perhaps of some significance if it were to enter the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Malacca, however, which is not so simple, and contest, for example, any interference with Chinese transshipment through the Indian Ocean, let's say, hypothetically, from the Indians. But even there, it would be at a serious disadvantage. However, it is an indication of Chinese determination to have a blue water Navy fleet in the future. And that is something we have to think about, and I think we have to engage, if we can, in serious discussions with the Chinese regarding the sort of balance of force and the evolution of our force structures and our respective interests, perhaps cooperative, perhaps conflicting, because only this way can we, in a sense, be in a reasonable position to evaluate at what point Chinese modernization, military modernization, could become, as it could, a serious threat to us.
Isn't the runway for that kind of knowledge just more than a decade? Don't we have to make that decision in order to, many, many years in advance, to begin to develop countermeasures?
That's right, and that's
so
why
how
such a dialogue has to begin, I think, soon. And I don't think it necessitates any dramatic decisions at this stage, but it'll provide us with a basis for making a judgment whether we're dealing with a country which is in some ways reminiscent of Imperial Germany vis-à-vis Great Britain, or of Nazi Germany vis-à-vis the other European states, or the Soviet Union vis-à-vis us. That is a potential future. But it will not be if we are smart, if the Chinese are smart. It will take two here to strike a relationship which is different from past imperial rivalries. That, in many respects, is the critical challenge of the 21st century. But we cannot answer it dogmatically in advance. We have to have a process by which we establish which of these alternative futures is more likely, and for which we have to prepare then, perhaps in the more negative case, very urgently.
Certainly, Chinese leadership words on this are about peaceful development. It's peaceful rise, and that they're emphasizing that they don't, they are not Imperial Germany, they are not the Soviet Union, that their interests and American interests are complementary, not conflicting.
Well, yes, and that shouldn't be taken as the literal truth forever. Right. But on the other hand, it would be equally bad to dismiss it. It does make a difference if a country declares to you, we'll bury you, as the Soviets did to us, or not to mention Hitler's intentions, or what Ahmadinejad said about Israel, for example. But, of course, beyond that, the future will be shaped by sort of a reality confrontation with realities. And we can do that only on the basis of being vigilant, intelligent, but not prejudging the future on the basis of our worst fears.
From Anish Jain in Manhattan, New York, from home. Since China's opening up to the outside world, it has seen cycles of political and social openness mixed with crackdowns and repression. How can the internet be a pathway to effect positive change? Are there any parallels to the Mideast, or do you think they are not analogous?
There are some parallels. The younger generation in China is already significantly different in its world outlook or world understanding than their parents, not to mention their grandparents. Certainly to the young people within the new Chinese middle class, it's estimated at about 250 to 300 million people. The younger people in that middle class, by and large, have access to computers. They're part of the internet. They are different than their parents. They are different in that respect than their leaders, who are a generation older. So it is an important change. Now, whether that can be translated into a more benign understanding of the world and a more determined commitment to the notion that we survive together or we sink together, time will only tell. But I think that by and large, it does create social pressures towards a pattern of conduct which might make China different from the countries which I cited as examples of an imperial competition that turned into something very, very nasty.
Question from Kathleen in Baltimore, Maryland. What role does Russia play in the relationship between the United States and China?
Well, it's a kind of ambivalent triangular relationship in which on the political level, and certainly on the level of Mr. Putin himself, who's just been awarded the Confucius Prize by some sort of rebellious section of the Confucius Prize Committee. Mr. Putin seems tempted to play the China card against us if he can. I don't think he can play it too well because, for one thing, the Chinese are not going to let them. And the Chinese feel much more self-assured than the Russians, and the Russians are much more worried about China than China is worried about Russia. So I don't think that will go too far. I think that the Russians, moreover, are profoundly fearful of China and greatly aware of the fact that the resource-rich territories in the Siberian area and in the Far East are increasingly vacant, literally vacant, and right next door to a country which is setting the pace for modernization without precedent historically.
There have been rumors of China stepping up to help finance the EU bailout fund. What consequences would this have for Sino-U.S. relationship? This is from Mark Corser.
Well, I think in the short run, probably benign if it was true, because if the EU crisis can be averted, even with Chinese financial assistance, the United States benefits from that because the negative consequences of the crisis could be quite horrendous. But I frankly doubt very much that the Chinese are going to go in on a large scale because it's chancy, it's uncertain, the Chinese don't have too much experience in that. So there may be some selective inflow of Chinese capital, but I doubt that there's going to be some sort of a large-scale bailout undertaken by the Chinese.
I think that's right. From Boston, Ruel Liebert. What should the U.S. response be to the increasing level of cyber attacks aimed at industrial and military targets in the U.S.?
First of all, establishing with some degree of precision whence they originate and who actually undertakes them. Is it just from the Chinese, or is it from some other countries? Is it from several countries at the same time? Is it from international crime syndicates and so forth? But once we know, well, first of all, on the obvious public level, we ought to protest. But on the non-public level, we ought to make it too costly for anyone who does it. Mm-hmm. That's very simple. I mean, if they are going to start playing, playing rough with our facilities or penetrating the governmental departments and so forth, if we don't have the capacity to retaliate in kind, then we have been goofing off. And so I think
retaliating kind on a cyber level.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Make it costly, and there are many ways that this can be done. So I hope we're doing some of it. Whoever it is that does it.
Yeah. Kenny from Waterville, Maine. The State Department has begun a program called 100,000 Strong, which seeks to have more U.S. citizens travel to study in China. What impact, if any, do you think this initiative will have on Sino-American relations in the long term?
It depends on how the 100,000 behave themselves. I think probably we can produce 100,000 Americans who will be acting responsibly, decently, maybe even inspiringly, particularly if they master Chinese and can sit down with their Chinese counterparts and discuss issues such as democracy, openness, pluralism, participation in a complex world, avoiding repetition of histories. Mm-hmm. I think that could be quite constructive.
Yeah. Hopefully they come back to the United States and help educate America about what China is.
That would be
also
helpful.
Also be helpful. Should the international community, this is from Greg Moorhead in Minnesota, should the international community be concerned that China seemingly ignores or is not concerned by the recent IAEA report about Iran's growing nuclear program?
Well, I think one has to bear in mind the fact that China has a next-door neighbor that is causing perhaps more concern for the Chinese than Iran, and not irrationally so. In fact, I think we have to ask ourselves, why are we so concerned about Iran but not about North Korea? And if we are concerned about both, then should we be focusing on one more than the other? Or perhaps we ought to ask ourselves, what's the best way of dealing with both of them, allowing for regional differences? The report by IAEA confirmed what most of us knew, namely that the Iranians are experimenting in the nuclear area with programs that could over time give them a nuclear capability. But we haven't learned much more than that. And we haven't learned, in any case, what is the best possible estimate at what point the Iranians will acquire a viable nuclear option, something that the North Koreans have come very close to having, and they already had a weapons test in effect in North Korea. So we probably learned not terribly much that we didn't know before, namely they're doing it, but that they're still some time away from really having it. And by really having it, I mean having the capacity to actually create a weapon, deploy it, and deliver it to a target with hostile intentions.
From Jeff in Buffalo, New York. Will we ever see a U.S.-China free trade agreement?
I don't know how old the questioner is, but I'll hazard the guess, not in my lifetime nor in his.
This is from Rory in New York, New York. America is increasing its military ties to East Asia because it sees China's military development as a potential threat to regional security. Yet China spends more on internal security than on their military, that is, as a percentage of GDP. How will China's internal stability, or lack thereof, affect U.S.-China relations?
Well, first of all, I don't know the basis for the judgment regarding how much they spend on external security versus internal security. My guess is that whatever estimate is available to the person who asked the question, it is at best a guess, because I don't think the Chinese actually publish specific figures on what we would call security, and they probably budget it in many different ways. Well, the Chinese have to make their own judgments regarding, what they want to spend their money on or waste their money on. Obviously, a regime that is authoritarian is more preoccupied with what we would consider to be excessive domestic security than we are. But I also think that over time, and I've spoken a little bit about the changing values of the middle class and particularly of the younger generation, I think China will evolve because it won't be able not to evolve if it doesn't evolve. It's, internet, access to information, plus such things as tens of thousands of Chinese studying abroad, 100,000 of them in the United States alone, and hundreds of thousands traveling, actually millions of them traveling abroad. All of that changes the nature of the sort of ability of regimes to control their populations in such a way that they are really isolated from the rest of the world.
This is from Philadelphia. It's from Yachi Wang. Some people held the point of view that it is China who should be blamed for the middle class squeeze in the United States because of trade between the U.S. and China. Chinese cheap goods flood into the U.S. domestic market. Do you think it would be a great loss if we cut down the trade volume with mainland China significantly?
Well, I don't understand the connection between buying Chinese, quote-unquote, cheap goods and the diminution of our middle class. I don't think our middle class went bankrupt buying Chinese goods. I think he's suggesting much more domestic.
I think he's suggesting we're losing jobs to China, middle-class jobs to China.
Well, first of all, what middle-class jobs? I think actually they're not really middle-class jobs that we have lost the most. It's the industrial workers who are at best in the sort of less privileged portions of the middle class. So I think there's some misunderstanding here.
Yeah. Do you think pressure, this is also from Yachi Wang, do you think pressure from the outside world is helpful or harmful to China when it's applied with respect to democracy or economic reform?
Well, I take it the question means, does it actually advance the cause of democracy in China? I don't think there's any kind of certain way of responding to it, but on balance, I would say that it is not a bad thing for the Chinese leadership to be aware of the possibly negative connotations that repression involves. And certainly Tiananmen Square is an example of something that really set the Chinese back a great deal in terms of their international standing. I think it's good for their leadership to ponder the consequences sometimes of certain actions, as it is for any other leadership in any other country, also to be aware of external reactions. Take a look at our own position over the years on a number of domestic issues. Do we or do we not take into account foreign reactions, and shouldn't we to some extent?
Likely we don't. Carson Tavener, Seattle, Washington. The Department of Defense newly minted Air-Sea Battle Doctrine is intended to provide future military options for countering Chinese military power in the Pacific. How will this affect the strategies of other U.S. government departments in their approach and support to this national security strategy?
Well, I think that's going to be conducted, so to speak, on its own dynamics and merits, and it'll depend also on how the Chinese-American relationship evolves. I'm not quite sure what the question addresses insofar as the attitude of other governmental departments. The Post Office Department is going to have some significant impact here, or what? Or
I guess they're
health,
suggesting
education, welfare,
commerce, or Treasury,
well,
or
obviously we have control on strategic goods, for example. We don't sell arms to the Chinese. Our NATO allies don't sell arms to the Chinese, even though some of our NATO allies are currently selling arms to the Russians. So, in that respect, one may even ask whether that is a good definition of fairness.
Yeah. Doesn't say where, but Andrew Phillips. Recently, President Obama urged the Chinese government to free up their currency and allow it to freely float with the market demand in order to allow it to be more competitive with to allow competition, fair competition between the United States and China. Will this happen anytime soon?
I don't think it's going to happen as the result of very open public demands. I think some economists feel that there's been already some shift in the Chinese position. But it is ultimately their responsibility, just as it is our responsibility to decide how much money we want to print. And as you know, we have printed some money lately, which doesn't necessarily endear us to those who have invested in our treasuries.
That's true. How does China's, this is from Jim Sykes, Madison, Wisconsin. How does China's close association with and great interest in Pakistan impact U.S.-China relations?
I don't think it impacts too much on our relations with China. To my knowledge, the Chinese have not taken any sort of overt position or even covert position on the rather complicated maneuvering the Pakistanis have been engaging in regarding the conflict within Afghanistan.
This is from Buffalo, New York, Guangzhou. How do you look at China's investments in Africa? Do you consider it a form of colonization?
I think that in the post-colonial age in which we now live, it is up to the Africans to define how they view it. After all, they are the ones that are concluding the arrangements. They're the ones who are either benefiting from these arrangements or are being exploited. And I think it's up to them to decide which it is, and I think it would be sort of patronizing for us to be making these judgments on their behalf.
This is from Annie, a senior at Colby College. I assume we have a venue at Colby. In the 1990s, the event that influenced Sino-U.S. relations was the aftermath of Tiananmen Square. In the 2000s, it was 9/11 and the global war on terrorism. What do you think it will be for Sino-U.S. relations in the next decade?
Well, it'll be either the consequences of mishandling of the relationship, either by us or by them, in which case we'll all be paying a high price for it, or it will be the beginnings of something new in international affairs, in which a preeminent world power finds a way of handling effectively a rising world power, and the latter is sufficiently intelligent to avoid triumphalism and conduct which would be inimical to some sort of a relatively stable relationship.
Esdine Fasazi, if the DPP wins the presidential election in 2012 in Taiwan, which I think is on January 14th, will Sino-American relations be affected?
Well, probably to some extent, yes, because there is a great deal of sensitivity in China regarding Taiwan. And there's also a lot of effort being made, incidentally, to expand the contacts between Taiwan and the mainland. There's now a fairly wide-ranging economic agreement between the two. There's now open travel between the two. There are quite a few Taiwanese citizens who have settled to live out their retirement years near Shanghai. It's estimated about 200,000 of them. There are even generals-to-generals exchanges. Retired generals from the mainland travel to Taiwan, and retired generals from Taiwan travel to the mainland. So there is a kind of movement that seems to point towards a gradual stabilization and normalization and maybe even transformation of the relationship. But of course, any dramatic political change can alter that, either because of what happens on the mainland or because of changes in the attitude of the Taiwanese.
Chris Mason from San Francisco. Are China's expanding military expenditures proportionate to its expanding GDP, and is in the increasing qualitative nature of military forces proportionate to China's increasing advanced technology sector?
I haven't made those measurements, but I would be interested in knowing what they would be if we did them regarding our defense budget. Currently, it is larger than of all the countries in the world combined. So it'd be interesting how these comparative arrangements, comparative measurements would turn out if we did it for both countries.
This is from Colleen O'Connor in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Occupy movement in the U.S. has support among the youth of China. How do you feel the Occupy movement may influence Chinese youth and Chinese thought? How will the growing power of Western influence over East Asian culture impact future relations with the U.S.?
Well, it could, of course, be the reverse. At some point, the Occupy movement here could be supporting some equivalent, political equivalent thereof, in China. I think that's part of the sort of logic of global interaction. And I think that's all to the good. I am in favor of China becoming more democratic, but I also am aware of the fact that it's easier to do so if you have had 200 years of democratic evolution under ideally pacific, stable conditions, as we have had. And it's a little more difficult to do it when you have, first of all, a 6,000-year-old history weighing on you, and also if you live in a country which is vastly populated and has had a terrifically difficult last 200 years.
This is from Nancy J. in Cranford, New Jersey. I think I need to add, I think we have scheduled for 45 minutes. So I have a cue card that says 15 minutes left. I don't think that's right.
I think we're finished.
Can somebody answer that question for me? I think we're down to.
I think we're talking to nobody.
No. 15 seconds. All right. Well, you've answered so many questions that this has been. We still have about 20 that we haven't answered, but you have been remarkably informative and allowed us to answer a lot of the questions to our venues. I want to thank all of our venues, thank all of our speakers, thank Dr. Brzezinski for a magnificent performance, and wish you that you enjoy the rest of the evening. So thank you all and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Good job.
you.
I'll just start talking.
Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah. All right, we have one more part of the program. I think tonight's program so far has really pointed out how important it is for us to be aware of what's happening in China. But more important than that is we have to be aware about what's happening in our own community. And the next portion of our program brings about community leaders who will be set up in a panel and discuss some of their feelings about tonight's program and about how they've interacted and their feelings about China. And the way we're going to set it up, we'll have the four panelists sitting up here in the front, five panelists sitting up here in the front. I'll try and control it up here. Each panelist will have about 5 minutes to give a short presentation, and the other panelists will have a chance to respond to them during that time. I'll introduce each panelist one at a time. We'll complete with one. When all the panelists have had a chance to speak and react to each other, we will open it up to the audience for some general questions.